Under the warm twilight of a Seattle afternoon, the Graystone Manor restaurant was a gem in the middle of the city, a place where the wealthy came and went, talking in low voices and smiling politely enough. Glasses of wine flowed, the sound of a piano wafted through the expensive space, and everything seemed perfect until Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, an elderly black woman, walked in. She wore a sophisticated ash-gray coat, walked slowly but surely, her eyes calm as if accustomed to places where people often thought, "You should not be here." No one said it out loud, but the look did. And then, the waiter, a young man named Ryan, turned that silence into action. He refused to serve her, coldly as if doing the right thing, but he didn't know. In a few minutes, the truth would bring him and the entire restaurant to a standstill, because the woman he despised was not an ordinary old woman. It was a moment when silent justice spoke, not with words, but with the weight of dignity. If you believe that justice does not need noise to shine, this story will touch you. Like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to join us on this thoughtful journey where justice comes in silence, and the truth speaks for itself. Seattle, late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it really is. Through the wide glass windows of Graystone Manor, golden rays poured across polished floors and white linen tables. The chandeliers hummed faintly above crystal drops catching the sun, scattering it in quiet fragments across the room. It was the hour when the city outside began to blur into stillness, and inside this restaurant, time seemed to slow down. A pianist, tucked in the corner near the bar, played something tender and unhurried. Guests spoke in low tones, as if every word needed to be wrapped in velvet before being released into the air. Everything here was measured every step, every glance, every breath. Graystone Manor was not a place where people came to eat. It was where they came to belong, or perhaps to prove that they did. The maître Clara stood near the entrance, her posture graceful, her smile perfectly symmetrical. She was young, early 20s, maybe, and she had mastered that delicate balance between courtesy and distance. Her eyes scanned each guest with quiet efficiency, reading their attire, their watch, their body language, their worth. It was subtle, the way she seemed warmer to some than others. No one noticed, or maybe everyone did, and simply pretended not to. That was how places like this worked. Elegance was often built on exclusion. Then, the door opened. A faint gust of cool autumn air slipped in, carrying with it the scent of rain and cedar from outside. And there she was, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, a woman in her 70s, perhaps a little older, stepped into the room. She moved slowly, carefully, but not because of weakness. Her movements had precision, like someone who'd learned to let time obey her pace. Her silver gray coat, finely embroidered along the sleeves, reflected the golden light just enough to reveal its quiet luxury. A small black handbag rested in her hand. She paused for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness inside. And in that brief pause, conversation shifted just slightly. The pianist didn't stop, but his rhythm changed, uncertain for a beat. A man in a tailored suit at the far corner lowered his voice mid-sentence. Two women, sipping white wine, exchanged a quick glance, the kind that lasted less than a second, but carried centuries of unspoken history. No one said a word, but something invisible had entered with her. Clara straightened her back, the professional smile returning almost automatically. "Good evening," she said, voice polite but tight. "Do you have a reservation?" "Ma'am, Mrs." Brooks nodded. Yes, under the name Brooks. Clara's eyes flickered for a fraction. Brooks, a simple name, but one she couldn't quite place among their regular clientele. Her manicured finger traced down the list on her clipboard, then stopped. Ah, yes, right this way. Mrs. Brooks. Her tone softened, but her body language didn't. She led the older woman across the restaurant past tables by the window, past the main floor where laughter and wine mingled, and stopped near a smaller corner by the kitchen hallway. "This table is available," Clara said, pulling out a chair. "Mrs." Brooks looked around. From here, she could see the servers rushing in and out of the kitchen doors, hear the clatter of plates being stacked. It wasn't unpleasant, just distant from the warmth of the room. But she didn't protest. She smiled, the kind of smile that could silence pity before it appeared. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice gentle, like an old melody. Clara nodded and left too quickly to notice the quiet disappointment in her own gesture. From a nearby table, a couple watched discreetly. The man frowned, then whispered something. The woman shook her head softly, her expression unreadable. They both returned to their plates. That's the thing about subtle prejudice. It rarely announces itself. It simply rearranges the seating chart. Mrs. Brooks sat alone, her hands resting lightly on the linen cloth. The napkin remained untouched. The glass of water beside her was empty. She waited. The waiter, Ryan, walked past twice without stopping. The first time, he avoided her table because he was busy. The second time, because he'd convinced himself she could wait. I've seen this before. Too many times. The quiet refusal. The invisible wall built from habits, not hatred. They say time changes people. I'm not so sure. Ryan moved briskly young, tall, confident in the way people often are when they've never had to doubt their place. He checked on a table of executives, refilled glasses, smiled at a woman in pearls, and glanced once more at Mrs. Brooks' corner. Still waiting. He hesitated. For a second, I thought he might walk over, but he didn't. Minutes stretched. Mrs. Brooks glanced toward the bar, where a man in a navy blue suit was seated alone. His posture was composed, but his eyes told another story sharp. Observant. Daniel Brooks. Though no one in the restaurant knew his name, he had been there since before his mother arrived, watching, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct. He knew how these places worked. He built this one. After all, yes, Daniel Brooks was the owner of Graystone Manor. He'd built it from nothing, from years of hard work, vision, and quiet endurance. Yet tonight, he sat silently, as his own mother became invisible within the very walls he had designed to represent excellence. He didn't move. Not yet. Sometimes, the most powerful lesson isn't taught through words, but through exposure letting truth reveal itself, raw and undeniable. A group of businessmen laughed loudly near the window. The pianist regained his rhythm. The evening went on, perfectly smooth for everyone else. Mrs. Brooks lifted the empty glass, placed it down softly, and folded her hands again. She didn't sigh, didn't frown. Her stillness was dignified, a quiet defiance that said, "I've seen worse, and I will not give you the power to define me." I wondered if Ryan noticed that stillness. Perhaps it unsettled him. Perhaps that's why he avoided her table again. Because calmness in the face of disrespect is sometimes the loudest sound in the room. Outside, the sunlight began to fade. The chandeliers grew brighter, masking the world beyond the glass. Inside, perfection continued its performance until the truth decided to take the stage. and that moment was closer than anyone realized. The door of Graystone Manor opened again, letting in a soft breath of Seattle's evening air. The pianist's melody wavered for a moment, just enough for a few heads to turn. The golden light outside had dimmed into amber, and through it stepped a woman whose presence seemed to alter the temperature of the room. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks didn't rush. Her steps were measured, deliberate, the kind that drew attention without asking for it. Time seemed to fold slightly around her, as if the world agreed to move at her pace. Her silver-gray coat, embroidered with delicate lace at the cuffs, caught the last streaks of sunset. The soft click of her low heels echoed faintly against the marble floor, steady and unapologetic. She carried a small black handbag, the kind that held little more than a handkerchief, a wallet, and perhaps a quiet piece of one's past. Her hair was neatly swept back, revealing a face that carried grace the way some carry authority effortlessly. The fine lines near her eyes weren't marks of age, but of endurance. No one said anything, but the air shifted. A conversation near the window faded mid-sentence. A waiter adjusted the collar of his shirt without knowing why. And from the far end of the room, a young woman in a pearl necklace tilted her head ever so slightly, studying the newcomer the way one might study an unfamiliar painting, beautiful, but not quite understood. There was nothing loud about Mrs. Brooks, yet her very existence seemed to challenge the quiet hierarchies that lingered beneath Graystone Manor's charm. I watched her, everyone did, though we all pretended not to. There was something disarming about how calm she looked. People often expect the elderly to be fragile, especially women like her, especially here. But Mrs. Brooks carried herself with the ease of someone who had long learned that composure is its own kind of armor. She approached the reception podium, where Clara, the young hostess, stood waiting. Clara had been rearranging the reservation cards, her polished nails tapping lightly against the clipboard. Her practiced smile returned as soon as she looked up, though it flickered for half a second when her eyes met Evelyn's. "Good evening," Clara greeted, her voice a little too polite, a little too careful. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" "Yes, Mrs." Brooks replied, her tone soft but unwavering. "Under the name Brooks." Clara scanned the list, pretending to check twice, even though the name was right there. Her posture straightened, professionalism returning to the surface. "Of course, Mrs. Brooks. Please, follow me." As they walked through the dining room, Evelyn's gaze traveled slowly across the space tablecloths white as bone, crystal glasses glowing in candlelight, silverware aligned with military precision. It was a beautiful room, but beauty, she knew, could sometimes hide the ugliest truths. She noticed how a few guests paused to watch her pass, not in hostility, but in that subtle, polite curiosity reserved for those who seemed slightly out of place. A man in a navy blazer shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to his companion. The woman beside him smiled faintly, the way people smile when they think they're being kind, but their eyes say something else. I could feel it too, that invisible current running through the air, the one that hums quietly whenever old habits of judgment wake up in a room. Clara stopped near a small table tucked close to the kitchen corridor. It was clean, perfectly set, yet unmistakably apart from the rest. "Here we are," she said, pulling out a chair. The position was subtle enough to be defensible. A manager could easily claim it was just available space. But Mrs. Brooks understood. People who had lived through decades of polite exclusion rarely needed it explained to them. "Thank you," she said simply, settling into her seat. Clara smiled, relieved, and returned to her post without noticing how her own actions echoed the quiet prejudice that had built institutions far grander than this restaurant. Mrs. Brooks placed her bag on the table beside her glass. She looked out toward the window, though she couldn't see the view. The light there was meant for others, the kind of light you had to be invited to sit under. Across the room, near the bar, Daniel Brooks lifted his eyes from his drink. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. Watching his mother take that seat was like hearing a note go slightly off in a song he had written himself. He didn't move, not yet. He had built Graystone Manor to be a place of refinement, a symbol of how far he had come. Yet in that moment, he realized refinement meant nothing without humanity. And the people who worked for him, dressed in black vests and polished shoes, had forgotten what kind of house they were serving. Mrs. Brooks, unaware or perhaps pretending to be, folded her napkin across her lap. The pianist began another tune, something slower, almost mournful. A waiter passed by her table without stopping. Another one followed, tray balanced with drinks, not sparing her a glance. The glass in front of her remained empty. She didn't tap it. She didn't call out. Her face remained still, her breathing even. That composure, how does one learn to keep it? I wondered if she knew that her silence was already rewriting the room. From a nearby table, a young couple began whispering. "She's been sitting there a while," the woman murmured. "No one's come." Her partner shrugged, eyes darting briefly to the corner. Maybe she's waiting for someone. Maybe she was. Maybe she was waiting for decency. Mrs. Brooks turned slightly, as if sensing Daniel's eyes on her. For a second, their gazes met. He gave nothing away, just the faintest nod, so slight that no one else could have noticed. It wasn't acknowledgement. It was understanding. She smiled back, almost imperceptibly, the kind of smile that says, "I see you. Let it play out." And he did. Ryan, the waiter assigned to that section, brushed past again. He laughed at something a guest said, placed a wine bottle down, then moved on, his path deliberately avoiding her table. When he finally glanced in her direction, it was with the uneasy curiosity of someone who couldn't decide if this guest belonged here. I wondered if he realized what he was doing, or if bias had become so natural it disguised itself as instinct. The restaurant glowed with warmth, but a thin chill had entered the air. The pianist hesitated again, missing a note. A few guests shifted, sensing the imbalance without understanding its cause. Mrs. Brooks lifted her empty glass once more, examining it under the soft light as though searching for something at the bottom. Then she set it down gently, folding her hands again. There was power in that gesture, quiet, deliberate, ancient, the kind of power that doesn't shout, doesn't need to. It waits, because truth always arrives on its own time, and in that silence, the restaurant began to reveal itself not through words, but through glances, posture, and avoidance. The polished perfection of Graystone Manor began to crack, not with noise, but with the weight of what it had tried to hide. Outside, the last light faded from the sky. Inside, something far brighter was preparing to emerge. I could feel it, the balance shifting, inch by inch, toward justice that spoke without sound. Clara stood behind the marble host stand, one hand resting lightly on the polished surface, the other absently adjusting the lapel of her blazer. From where she stood, the restaurant looked like a perfect painting, every chair aligned, every candle flickering at the same height, every guest dressed as though they belonged in an old magazine ad for class. It was order, precision, perfection, and she was the gatekeeper of that perfection. She noticed Mrs. Evelyn Brooks still standing near the entrance. The older woman's coat caught the last of the afternoon light, making her seem almost part of another time, like something softer that didn't quite match the sharp lines of Graystone Manor's decor. Clara smiled, but not with warmth. It was the professional kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes. She glanced at her reservation list again, pretending to be busy. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth but tight. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am, Mrs.?" Brooks nodded slightly. "Yes, under the name Brooks." The sound of her voice was calm, deliberate, carrying a quiet confidence that unsettled Clara for reasons she couldn't name. Clara scanned the clipboard again, though she had already seen the name. "Ah, yes, here we are." For a moment, she hesitated. There were open tables near the windows, beautiful spots with a view of the Seattle skyline, bathed in amber light, but her eyes flicked to the corner near the kitchen corridor, where a smaller table sat half in shadow. "This way, please," Clara said, leading the way. "Mrs." Brooks followed without question, her steps soft but steady. The sound of her shoes against the marble seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the room itself noticed her. Heads turned, not out of hostility, but out of something more complicated, curiosity disguised as indifference. A man in a gray suit lowered his newspaper slightly as she passed. A woman in pearls watched the reflection of the older woman glide across her wine glass. None of them spoke, but their silence spoke enough. "I've seen that silence before. It's the kind that fills the space between decency and discomfort, the kind that lets prejudice pretend it isn't there." When they reached the small table, Clara gestured with a polite sweep of her hand. "Here we are, Mrs. Brooks." The table sat near the kitchen door, where faint clatters and bursts of laughter drifted out between swinging panels. It wasn't dirty or unpleasant, just removed. From here, one couldn't see the pianist, or the grand chandelier, or the golden glow of the main dining room. "Mrs." Brooks paused, her eyes sweeping the space. She took it in the smell of butter and rosemary from the kitchen, the rhythm of footsteps rushing past, the brief glimpses of polished plates disappearing behind the door. Clara felt the pause stretch longer than comfortable. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked, though her tone carried more concern for the delay than for the woman's comfort. "Mrs." Brooks smiled. It was a small, graceful smile, the kind that carried both forgiveness and understanding. "Everything's fine, dear," she said softly. "Thank you." She sat down, carefully placing her bag on the chair beside her. Clara adjusted the napkin, nodded quickly, and left, relieved to retreat into the safety of her podium. From her seat near the bar, Daniel Brooks watched the exchange with the stillness of someone who had seen this scene play out too many times. He didn't move, didn't speak. His face was unreadable, but his eyes followed every motion, the hesitation in Clara's step, the way her voice changed, the slight curve of her shoulders when she turned away. He had built this restaurant to be a sanctuary of excellence, but at that moment, it looked more like a mirror reflecting the world he thought he had escaped. "Mrs." Brooks reached for the glass of water on her table, only to find it empty. She folded her hands instead, resting them gently on the linen. Around her, waiters moved quickly, silver trays gleaming, voices low but efficient. Not one of them stopped at her table. The pianist shifted into a slower tune, something soft and nostalgic. A few diners hummed along quietly. "Mrs." Brooks sat perfectly still, her posture straight, her expression calm. She had lived long enough to know that anger, especially here, in a room like this, was never the weapon that won. Her stillness became a presence. Even those who weren't watching began to feel it. Ryan, the waiter assigned to that section, noticed her finally. He hesitated near the counter, a tray of empty glasses in hand. Something in his chest tightened, though he didn't understand why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was habit. He turned away. I watched him go, and I wondered how many small moments like this build the world we live in. Not grand acts of cruelty, but quiet decisions to look away. From another table, a couple whispered. "Is she alone?" the woman asked. "Looks like it," the man replied. Strange they'd seat her there. The woman nodded slightly, then turned back to her meal. Their sympathy, if it existed at all, lasted less than a heartbeat. Daniel's glass of whiskey remained untouched. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, gaze fixed on his mother. The faintest crease appeared between his brows. He wanted to stand up, to correct what he saw, but he waited. Evelyn had taught him patience, not the kind that tolerates injustice, but the kind that lets truth reveal itself in its full, undeniable form. Clara returned briefly to the floor. Walking past Mrs. Brooks's table, she smiled mechanically, checking other guests, adjusting silverware, avoiding the one seat that seemed to weigh on her. Evelyn looked up, meeting her eyes for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief but enough. There was no anger in her gaze, only a quiet steadiness that made Clara's breath catch. For reasons she couldn't explain, the young hostess felt small. Mrs. Brooks turned her attention to the window beyond the main room. She couldn't see much from her corner, just the faint reflection of light against glass. But she smiled anyway, as if seeing something others couldn't. The peony struck a wrong note. A waiter dropped a fork. Tiny imperfections began to ripple through the perfect image of Graystone Manor, like cracks beneath porcelain. No one noticed consciously, but the energy in the room had shifted. Something unspoken was happening, and it didn't need sound to be heard. Mrs. Brooks sat, serene and silent, while the restaurant around her quietly betrayed itself. Sometimes, justice doesn't announce its arrival. It just waits calm, steady, inevitable, and though no one yet realized it, Graystone Manor had already begun to teach its lesson. Ryan moved through the dining room, like a man on a schedule. His tall frame and pressed uniform gave him the look of confidence, the kind built not from pride, but repetition. He knew this floor well, the rhythm of footsteps, the right angle to hold a tray, when to smile and when not to. At 28, he had perfected the art of seeming busy. From the corner of his eye, he saw her, the elderly woman sitting near the kitchen doors. Her table was simple, the kind meant for quick meals, not the slow conversations Graystone Manor was known for. Her coat was folded neatly over the chair beside her, her posture straight. There was no phone in her hand, no menu lifted, just stillness. He meant to walk over, maybe offer water, maybe a smile, but then another guest waved him down. Two men in tailored suits needed refills on their bourbon, and the couple near the window wanted the wine list again. So, he turned. It's strange how easily people convince themselves they're too busy to be kind. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks waited. She had waited before at bus stops in the rain, at checkouts where eyes slid past her, in offices where her name was mispronounced on purpose. Waiting, she knew, was not new, but tonight felt different. The silence wasn't hostile, just hollow, like a note played slightly off-key. A soft laugh rose from a nearby table. The clinking of silverware, the piano's melody, the faint hum of conversation, everything around her carried on, oblivious. Yet, there was an order to the neglect, a rhythm she recognized. Ryan passed again, this time with a tray of sparkling water. 3 glasses for the group near the bar, none for her. She followed him with her eyes, not in anger, but in observation. Her expression didn't change. There was a dignity in her calmness that the room didn't quite know how to receive. I watched her, too, the way she folded her hands lightly, the way she lifted her chin just enough to see without seeming to stare. There was power in that quiet, the kind that unnerves those who mistake stillness for weakness. Daniel Brooks sat a few tables away, silent. The ice in his glass had melted, the amber liquid untouched. He saw every pass Ryan made, every hesitation, every look that avoided his mother's table. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. He said nothing. Not yet. Sometimes restraint is the sharpest blade. Ryan stopped by another table, taking orders, laughing at a joke from a guest he'd served before. He moved naturally among them. He didn't think of the woman in the corner as neglected. He thought of her as waiting her turn. That's how indifference often works. It hides behind procedure. Mrs. Brooks' glass remained empty. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cool rim, then let go. No sigh, no complaint, just patience. I think patience can be the most confronting thing in the world. It forces others to face what they've done without the comfort of excuses. At the bar, a man in a dark blazer whispered to his date. "She's been sitting there for a while," he said, nodding toward Evelyn. The woman followed his gaze, her brow furrowing slightly. Strange. "Did she just come in?" he shrugged, sipping his drink. "Maybe she's waiting for someone." They returned to their laughter, and the moment passed like smoke. Ryan returned from the kitchen, passing by again. He noticed her now. Her eyes met his briefly. There was no accusation there, only a quiet steadiness that unsettled him. He felt something tighten in his chest, a flicker of guilt or irritation, he couldn't tell which. He nodded faintly, a half gesture, and moved on again. Daniel's gaze followed him. His fingers tapped once against the glass, a rhythm of control. He knew what this was. Not overt discrimination. Graystone Manor would never allow that. No. This was the subtler form, the one that hides behind politeness and timing, the one that kills slowly but leaves no mark. In the kitchen, Ryan leaned against the counter, exhaling. He poured himself a quick glass of water, glanced at the floor plan, and saw her table number highlighted on his section list. A small irritation crossed his mind. He wasn't sure why she bothered him. Maybe it was her composure. Maybe it was the way she made him feel seen without saying a word. When he stepped back out, Claire passed him near the host stand. "Table 23 hasn't been served yet," she said quietly, glancing toward the corner. "I'll get to her," Ryan replied, voice firm. "I've been swamped." Clara nodded, unconvinced but unwilling to press. "Just make sure she's taken care of." Ryan gave a tight smile. Of course, but he didn't move right away. He returned to his other tables, the ones that tipped well, the ones that matched the image he wanted this place to reflect. "Mrs." Brooks lifted the corner of her napkin, smoothing it across her lap. Her eyes drifted to the chandelier above, the light reflected in her pupils, like 2 small suns. She wasn't angry. If anything, she looked almost reflective. I wondered what memories sat behind that calm. The years she'd seen people like Ryan grow into men who thought manners could replace morals. The decades of being tolerated, but never truly seen. Time stretched. The piano's soft notes melted into the clinking of dishes. From her seat, she could see Daniel, though she didn't look directly at him. There was something unspoken between them, an understanding that neither needed to name. Ryan walked by again. He looked busy carrying trays, taking notes, adjusting silverware. To everyone else, he was efficient. To Evelyn, he was invisible. At some point, she smiled faintly to herself, a slow, knowing smile. It wasn't amusement, it was recognition. She had met this kind of man many times before, the kind who believed good service was something earned by appearance. The restaurant thrived in its illusion of refinement. But refinement means little when compassion is missing. Finally, Ryan stopped near her table, his voice brisk. "Someone will be right with you, ma'am," he said without meeting her eyes. Then he turned away before she could answer. Her voice followed softly behind him. "Take your time, dear." He froze for half a second. The calm in her tone disarmed him. He didn't know what to do with it. He kept walking. Daniel set his glass down. The sound, quiet as it was, seemed louder than it should have been. His reflection in the mirror behind the bar looked back at him. Older somehow. Heavier. He realized this moment the one unfolding before his eyes wasn't new. It was history repeating itself, just dressed in finer clothes. And Evelyn, seated there in the corner of her son's restaurant, embodied everything that the world often misunderstands about strength. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It was about composure, the kind that makes arrogance collapse under its own weight. As the evening stretched on, the light outside dimmed into a soft gray. The restaurant shimmered in gold and glass. From afar, nothing looked wrong, yet for those who could see clearly, everything was. Graystone Manor remained elegant, but somewhere between the chandeliers and the corner table, morality had started to crack, and Evelyn Brooks, sitting silently in her chair, had already begun to expose it one quiet breath at a time. The room looked the same, yet something inside it had changed. The chandeliers still shimmered above the tables. The pianist still played his gentle notes. But a faint discomfort had begun to spread through Graystone Manor like perfume gone sour. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks remained at her table near the kitchen, unmoving, her hands folded neatly before her. Her untouched glass of water caught the light, a small crystal mirror that reflected the room's uneasy beauty. Ryan passed again, careful not to meet her eyes. His shoulders stiffened each time he crossed that corner, as if her stillness accused him more loudly than words ever could. He moved faster, not from duty, but from avoidance. A young couple seated near the center of the dining room had noticed. The woman, her hair pinned in an elegant twist, tilted her head toward the corner. "That lady's been sitting there for quite a while," she whispered. Her partner, a man in a navy sports coat, glanced over briefly before returning his attention to his plate. "Maybe she's waiting for someone," he said, his tone dismissive. "Don't make a thing out of it." "I'm not," she replied softly. "It's just, no one's been to her table." The man hesitated, then looked again, this time a little longer. "Strange," he murmured. He didn't sound concerned, only curious, the kind of curiosity that keeps one comfortable, never responsible. At another table, 4 businessmen sat laughing over steak and bourbon. Their laughter filled the air with confidence, the kind built on being at ease everywhere they went. One of them, A gray-haired man with an expensive watch noticed Evelyn's corner, too. His smile faltered for half a second. "They seated her there," he said quietly, gesturing with his glass. Another man shrugged. "Probably didn't make a reservation. Happens." The first one nodded, half satisfied with the answer. "Still, you'd think they'd at least bring her water." No one replied. They all turned back to their plates, the matter already dismissed. It was easier that way. That's how it usually goes. Not with shouting or open cruelty, just silence, small enough to fit between a fork and a napkin. From his place near the bar, Daniel Brooks watched the small shifts, the sideways glances, the unfinished thoughts, the discomfort people tried to disguise with conversation. He saw the story writing itself without a single word being spoken. His restaurant, his creation, was quietly exposing itself. He took a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the edge of the bar. The reflection in the mirror showed his face in half light, steady but strained. "Mrs." Brooks lifted her eyes briefly, as if sensing him watching. There was no signal exchanged, no nod of recognition. Yet something invisible passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or the kind of patience shared by those who have waited too long for fairness to catch up. The pianist continued to play, unaware. His melody drifted through the air, soft and fragile. Even that, somehow, sounded off like a song trying to fill a silence too heavy to carry. Ryan returned to the front of the room to take new orders. When Clara approached, she spoke in a low voice. "Has table 23 been helped yet?" Ryan straightened. "I'm getting to it." Her eyes flickered. "It's been over 20 minutes. He exhaled sharply, forcing a smile. I said, "I'll get to it." Then, more quietly, "She's fine. Fine." That word, how easily people use it to bury guilt. Clara hesitated. She wasn't sure whether to press further. In her mind, Mrs. Brooks looked composed, not upset. The restaurant was busy. Maybe it wasn't her place to interfere. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. So she let it go. The truth is, racism doesn't always need villains. Sometimes it just needs silence. "Mrs." Brooks reached for her napkin, refolding it carefully, a small, deliberate motion. Her eyes wandered across the room, the clinking glasses, the dim amber light, the people laughing, eating, living comfortably in a world that felt built for them. She didn't envy them, but she understood the cost of that comfort. Her gaze stopped on the young couple again. The woman smiled awkwardly and looked away. Evelyn's smile returned, patient, unbroken. I wondered what she saw in them. Pity, discomfort, or perhaps the slow awakening that comes when conscience stirs in ordinary people. Daniel lifted his hand slightly, motioning for a refill he didn't need. When Ryan came to the bar, Daniel watched him work, the way his hands moved quickly, the way his face carried that practiced expression of attentiveness. Ryan didn't know who Daniel was. That ignorance gave him courage. "Busy night?" Daniel asked casually. Ryan nodded. "Always like this on weekends. Lot of special folks tonight." "Special Daniel," repeated quietly. Ryan chuckled. "You know the kind that tip big. Order the good stuff. Expect you to read their mind. Keeps the night interesting." Daniel said nothing. He just let the silence hang until Ryan grew uneasy. Then Daniel smiled faintly, almost kindly. "You should check on everyone, though. You never know who might surprise you." Ryan shrugged, already turning away. "Sure thing." But he didn't go to table 23. He passed by again, Pretending not to see, Mrs. Brooks didn't move. She sat in stillness that seemed almost deliberate, now a mirror held up to the room's discomfort. Her calm was no longer just patience. It was protest, quiet, but impossible to ignore. The young woman from the center table whispered again, "She's still waiting." Her partner shifted in his chair. "Then say something," she said softly. He frowned. "It's not my business." She looked at him for a long moment, then at Evelyn. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words died before they formed. No one wanted to break the illusion of civility. It's easier to live in comfort than to confront the truth that comfort comes at someone else's expense. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. The piano slowed. The sound of laughter rose and fell like waves against stone. And there, in the center of all that refinement, his mother sat the embodiment of grace, surrounded by people who didn't yet know they were watching their own reflection. The strange thing about injustice is that it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and only the quietest people can hear it. "Mrs." Brooks looked down at her empty glass and smiled faintly. That smile, it wasn't forgiveness. It was something deeper, heavier. The smile of someone who has learned that dignity is not given by others. It is claimed, silently, and it endures. Around her, conversations continued, but their tone had changed. Words grew slower, glances longer. The atmosphere, once comfortable, now carried a faint tremor, as if the room itself knew it was being watched by something greater than its own luxury. I think every room reaches that moment, the one where people begin to feel their own conscience breathing beside them. And in Graystone Manor, that moment had arrived. The murmur of the dining room swelled and softened like a tide. Silver cutlery tapped against porcelain. Glasses chimed softly, and the faint melody of the piano drifted across the air like smoke thin, almost weightless. The world of Graystone Manor had resumed its rhythm. Almost. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks sat quietly at her table, her posture impeccable, her face calm. Her glass remained empty, the faint ring of condensation around it slowly fading away. She looked at it for a moment, then turned her gaze elsewhere, not in frustration, but in thought. Across the room, the laughter of a nearby table filled the air again. Waiters moved briskly, balancing trays, refilling drinks, offering polite smiles. Life, it seemed, went on perfectly fine for everyone else. Evelyn's fingers rested on the edge of the linen napkin. She didn't fidget or sigh. Her hands stayed still, graceful, deliberate. There was no sign of annoyance in her eyes, only that quiet patience that unnerves those who expect complaint. I found myself holding my breath, as if waiting for her to react. But she didn't, and in that silence, her stillness became louder than any voice could have been. The waiter, Ryan, moved past again, close enough to feel the weight of her presence, but not close enough to acknowledge it. He avoided her table as though it were invisible, though deep down, he knew it wasn't. Every time he crossed that side of the room, a small pulse of guilt tugged at his chest. Still, he pretending is easier than admitting. Daniel Brooks, still seated near the bar, watched quietly. The amber light caught the reflection of his mother's face in his glass calm, unwavering, familiar. He had seen that expression before, in boardrooms and at funerals, in moments when others would have broken. Evelyn Brooks didn't break. She didn't bend to indignity. She let it expose itself. She adjusted the collar of her coat slightly, the soft gray fabric catching the glow from the chandeliers. Then she looked around the room, not to demand attention, but to observe. She took in the polished silver, the immaculate table settings, the couples in their quiet conversations. Her eyes lingered on no one. Yet everyone who glanced her way felt as if they'd been seen. There was something unsettling in that kind of composure. It demanded reflection. It forced the world to pause and see itself. Ryan brushed past again, tray balanced with 2 empty wine glasses. For a brief second, their eyes met. He froze mid-step, his throat tightening. He wanted to look away but couldn't. There was no anger in her gaze, no accusation, only a kind of gentle knowing. It was the kind of look that reminded him of his grandmother, who had taught him better manners than this. He blinked, forced a smile that never reached his eyes, and turned toward another table. He didn't stop. "Mrs." Brooks exhaled softly, her smile faint but real. She reached for her purse and pulled out a small book leather-bound, worn from use. She opened it quietly and began to read. Her movements were unhurried, her breathing even. The act itself was simple, but in a room full of noise and neglect, it became a declaration. I am not invisible. I wondered if the others saw it, the quiet power of her dignity. Some did. At the center table, the young woman who had noticed earlier looked again. "She's still waiting," she whispered to her partner. He sighed, stirring his drink. If she wanted something, she'd ask. The woman frowned. Maybe she shouldn't have to. Her words fell into the air, heavier than either of them expected. The man said nothing after that. The businessmen at the corner table kept laughing, but their rhythm faltered. One of them gestured vaguely toward Evelyn's direction. "It's strange," he said under his breath. "I've never seen anyone ignored like that here." The others nodded, but no one stood. Daniel watched them, all his staff, his guests, his mother, and felt the slow burn of realization settle in his chest. This wasn't just about bad service. It was about something deeper, something woven into the very fabric of civility that people like Ryan and Clara mistook for politeness. It was about who the world chooses to see. Mrs. Brooks turned another page in her book, the faint rustle of paper catching Ryan's attention as he passed again. He slowed down this time. The sound seemed to pierce the comfortable hum of the room. He hesitated, tray in hand. For a moment, he thought about stopping. He thought about apologizing. But then a new group of diners entered, and the rhythm of his work resumed. He let the moment pass. Again. Evelyn's eyes followed him briefly, then softened. She closed her book and folded her hands over it, resting it on the table as if to mark an invisible line, one that didn't need to be spoken to exist. Sometimes I think the truest power isn't in what we say, but in what we refuse to give away our peace, our dignity, our grace. The pianist shifted to a different melody now, slower, more contemplative. The music filled the air like an apology no one had the courage to speak aloud. Clara, behind the host stand, noticed too. She bit her lip, watching the older woman sit there with quiet patience. For the first time that night, she felt something uncomfortable, not guilt exactly, but awareness. The kind that lingers when you realize you're part of the problem simply because you did nothing. Evelyn lifted her gaze once more, this time toward the bar. Daniel's eyes met hers. They exchanged no words, no gestures, but Daniel's breath caught, the same way it always did when he saw his mother rise above something that would have broken others. She smiled at him faintly, and in that smile, there was no demand for rescue, only trust. She had taught him long ago that injustice, when met with calm, becomes its own undoing. People cannot fight what they cannot provoke. Ryan walked past one last time. She looked up at him, not sharply, not demanding, just a gentle glance that carried both history and grace. And for the first time that night, he felt the full weight of what he had done. He turned away, jaw tight, suddenly aware of the distance between who he was and who he should have been. Evelyn didn't know if he would come back, and she didn't need to. She reached for her empty glass again, touched the rim lightly with her fingertips, and smiled. A small, peaceful smile. It wasn't forgiveness. It was freedom, the kind that belongs only to those who refuse to let bitterness define them. Around her, the restaurant continued to hum, unaware that the quietest person in the room had just become its center. That's the thing about calmness. It bends the air around it. It makes arrogance tremble, even when arrogance doesn't understand why. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks waited still, but she was no longer waiting to be served. She was waiting for the world to see itself. And whether they knew it or not, everyone in that room had already begun to. From his table near the bar, Daniel Brooks sat quietly, a glass of whiskey resting untouched before him. The amber light above caught the rim, scattering faint reflections across the counter. He wore a navy suit, tailored to precision, his tie loosened just enough to appear casual. On the surface, he looked like any other well-dressed man enjoying a solitary evening, but his eyes, steady, focused, betrayed the truth. He wasn't here to relax. He was watching. From his seat, he could see almost the entire dining room. The elegant sprawl of Graystone Manor unfolded before him like a stage. The chandeliers glowed, the piano whispered, and waiters moved and practiced choreography. But his gaze was fixed on one point, the corner table near the kitchen doors, where an elderly woman sat in silence. Every time Ryan passed her, Daniel's jaw tensed. The young waiter was quick, confident, and efficient with everyone else, but with her nothing. A deliberate kind of nothing. The kind that wasn't loud, but was sharp enough to cut through the noise. Daniel had built this place with purpose. Every inch of Graystone Manor reflected his story, his rise from a modest upbringing, his determination to create a space where excellence had no color. Yet now, watching his own employee ignore a woman who embodied everything he'd worked for, he felt something cold and familiar stir within him. He looked at the empty glass on her table and felt the sting of irony. No one in the room knew who he was. They saw him only as another patron, another suit in a sea of success. It was a role he'd learned to play well. Sometimes, power works best when it hides in plain sight. I've always believed silence can reveal more than speech. Watching people, when they think no one's watching, that's when you learn who they really are. Ryan brushed past again, balancing a tray of desserts. He leaned toward a table of businessmen, flashing that service smile, bright, professional, practiced. Then he turned, glanced toward the corner where Evelyn sat, and kept walking. Daniel's eyes followed him with the precision of someone counting seconds. 27 minutes. That's how long she'd been sitting there. No water, no acknowledgement, no service. He glanced at Clara near the host stand. The young hostess avoided his line of sight, though she seemed uneasy. Her hand fiddled with the edge of her clipboard, her posture too rigid for comfort. She knew something was wrong, but uncertainty can be paralyzing. A couple near the center table whispered again. A few heads turned. The ripple of awareness spread across the room like an uninvited truth, quiet, invisible, and unstoppable. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the base of his glass. He felt the heat of anger under his calm exterior, but he didn't let it rise. Anger, he knew, gives people an excuse to dismiss you. Composure makes them face themselves. The bartender passed by, wiping the counter. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, noticing Daniel's untouched drink. Daniel nodded, his voice even. "Perfectly fine." But nothing about it was fine. He looked back at the woman in the corner. Her coat glimmered faintly in the chandelier's glow. She sat upright, elegant as ever, reading a small leather-bound book. She turned each page slowly, her fingers steady, even from a distance. Her composure was palpable, like a quiet force commanding respect without asking for it. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. There was pride. Yes, but beneath it, a sorrow he hadn't expected. To the rest of the room, she was just an elderly woman waiting too long for service. To him, she was the reason this place existed. He built Graystone Manor for her, for people like her, for the countless nights she'd worked double shifts so he could have books for school, for every time she'd been ignored, underestimated, dismissed, and never once lowered her head. And now, here she was, in his restaurant, experiencing the same indignity he swore he'd left behind. Sometimes the past doesn't repeat, it waits. He looked toward Ryan again. The waiter was at the far end of the room, pouring wine with exaggerated care. Every movement said, "Look how professional I am." But Daniel could see the truth behind it. Confidence without conscience is just vanity dressed in uniform. He didn't stand yet. He needed to see where this would go. People reveal themselves fully only when they think they're safe. Clara stepped away from the host stand, walking toward the dining area. Her heels clicked softly against the marble. She stopped halfway, hesitating again. Then she turned back, pretending to check the reservation list once more. The small cowardices of good people, that's how injustice survives. The pianist played on, unaware. The melody lingered like a prayer that refused to be answered. Daniel's eyes drifted back to the corner. Evelyn closed her book and rested her hands over it. Her face was serene. The faintest smile touched her lips, not of amusement, but of recognition. She knew. She had always known. It struck him then she wasn't enduring this in silence out of helplessness. She was teaching, again, like she had when he was a boy, sitting at their old kitchen table, trying to understand why the world refused to see her worth. She was letting this place tell on itself, and in that realization, Daniel felt something shift. This wasn't humiliation, it was revelation. The restaurant wasn't failing her. It was exposing itself, one silent second at a time. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his first of the night. The burn steadied him. Around him, conversations carried on, the room unaware that every passing moment was carving the shape of its own lesson. Ryan crossed by once more, tray empty now, and finally glanced toward the bar. His eyes met Daniel's for the briefest instant. There was no recognition there, no suspicion, just the casual indifference of someone who thinks he knows the hierarchy of the room. Daniel didn't blink. He held the gaze long enough for Ryan to shift uncomfortably and look away. That was the thing about real power. It never needs to announce itself. From his seat, Daniel could see everything, the unease spreading among guests, the nervous tension in Clara's movements, the hollow rhythm of service that now felt exposed. And in the middle of it all, Evelyn Brooks sat like a center of gravity, still and dignified, her silence heavier than any reprimand could ever be. I sometimes think that justice doesn't arrive. It unfolds, slowly, like dawn creeping through curtains, until the light is too much to ignore. Daniel set his glass down. The faint sound of it touching the wood seemed to echo farther than it should have. He straightened his jacket, his expression calm, his decision made. He wasn't going to let anger do the talking. He was going to let truth speak for itself. The night was far from over, but for Graystone Manor, the lesson had already begun. For a long time, Daniel Brooks did not move. He sat at his table near the bar, one hand resting on the base of his glass, the other pressed lightly against the folded napkin beside it. The light from the chandelier above him traced faint patterns across the surface of the table, geometric, precise, unfeeling. He looked out over the dining room, the empire he had built with patience and pride. Graystone Manor, a place meant to symbolize success, refinement, equality, a place where anyone, regardless of the color of their skin, could walk in and be treated with respect. That had been the promise, and yet there she sat, his mother, alone, unacknowledged, invisible. The truth of it cut deeper than anger ever could. He'd imagined this night differently. When she told him she wanted to visit the restaurant for the first time, he'd smiled, quietly proud. He'd reserved her table himself under her name, Evelyn Brooks, not as the mother of the owner, but as a guest like any other. That was important to her. "Let me come as a customer, not as your mother," she'd said. "I want to see it for what it really is." Now he understood why. It was one thing to believe you'd built something pure. It was another to see the cracks forming beneath its surface. He watched Ryan move about the room, carrying trays, refilling glasses, charming guests with that easy smile. The young man had been with them for nearly a year. He was capable, confident, popular among the regulars. Daniel had even considered promoting him to a floor supervisor next quarter. Now, watching him bypass Evelyn's table again, her glass still empty, Daniel felt the air in his lungs tighten. He wanted to stand, to cross the room, to say something. But he didn't, not yet. Sometimes the most painful part of power is restraint. He leaned back in his chair, eyes steady, breath slow. If he intervened now, it would be anger that spoke, and anger, he knew, was fleeting. He needed truth undeniable, complete, the kind that revealed itself through its own decay. He wanted to see how far Ryan's indifference would go. He wanted to know if his restaurant had truly learned what he'd built it to teach. Evelyn sat motionless, unaware, or perhaps perfectly aware of her son's gaze. The light brushed the silver threads in her hair, turning them to gold. There was no trace of offense on her face, no tension in her shoulders, only the calm of someone who understood the game long before it began. Daniel's mind drifted, uninvited, to his childhood. He saw her again, standing in the kitchen of their old house, her hands deep in soapy water, a faint gospel tune humming on her lips. He remembered the day she came home after being refused service at a local diner. She hadn't cried. She hadn't yelled. She'd sat him down and said, "Son, the world will not always see your worth, but that doesn't make you smaller. It makes them smaller for missing it." And now, in this gleaming restaurant bearing the reflection of her sacrifice, that lesson returned only this time. It was him who needed to hear it. Across the room, Ryan laughed with a group of businessmen, gesturing with ease, as though he had done nothing wrong. Clara passed by again, her expression tight, her conscience visibly stirring. She hesitated at the edge of the dining floor, watching the same injustice unfold, but unable to cross the invisible line that kept civility above courage. Daniel could almost hear her thoughts. "It's not my place. Someone else will fix it. No one would. Not yet." The pianist shifted into a slower tune, melancholic, deliberate. The notes hung in the air like the echo of something forgotten. Daniel lifted his drink but didn't sip. He just stared into the amber surface, where the chandelier's reflection trembled faintly. His reflection stared back at him, fractured by the glass. What is success worth, he wondered, if it cannot protect the people who built it? Evelyn turned her head slightly, catching sight of him from across the room. Her eyes met his for a brief moment. It wasn't surprise or appeal. It was recognition, a soft acknowledgement, as if to say, "I know you're watching. Let them show you who they are." He lowered his gaze, the corner of his mouth tightening. Her restraint wasn't weakness. It was her way of holding a mirror to the room. Every guest who noticed and said nothing, every employee who hesitated, each became part of the reflection. Ryan brushed past again, this time carrying a tray of empty plates toward the kitchen. As he passed Evelyn's table, her napkin fluttered slightly to the floor. It landed at his feet. He looked down, saw it, hesitated for half a second. Then, without a word, he stepped over it and kept walking. Daniel's hand clenched beneath the table. The decision to remain silent grew heavier by the second. I could have stopped it right then. I could have said his name, and the whole room would have turned. But I didn't. Sometimes, the only way to teach a man what respect means is to let him hear the sound of his own disrespect echoing back at him. Evelyn leaned down, picked up the napkin herself, folded it neatly again, and placed it on the table. Her face didn't change. Not a flicker of irritation, just composure. Pure, deliberate composure. Daniel looked away for a moment, swallowing hard. Anger without control felt cheap, but the quiet kind, the kind that made you look in the mirror, that was different. That was justice. He sat there, still and silent, the owner of a place he no longer recognized. To the rest of the dining room, he was still just another guest. They didn't know that the man in the navy suit who watched everything unfold had built this empire from the ground up. That every stone, every polished glass, every plate of food carried his name. They didn't know that the woman in the corner, quietly ignored, was the mother of that same man. And perhaps that was fitting, because prejudice rarely sees the truth. It only sees the surface. Ryan reemerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He stopped to joke with another waiter, unaware of the gaze that now followed him like a shadow. Clara approached again, her voice hushed. "Ryan," she said, "the lady in the corner, she hasn't been served." He sighed, brushing her off. "I'll get to her. When I can." That was it. The words hung in the air, brittle and careless. Daniel stood then, slowly, quietly, not to act yet, but to steady himself. His reflection in the glass partition stared back, calm but burning beneath the surface. He didn't need to shout. The truth was already writing itself, one ignored gesture at a time. And Evelyn, his mother, the woman the world had always underestimated, sat in her quiet strength, letting the scene play out exactly as it needed to. Sometimes, justice doesn't need intervention. It just needs witnesses. Daniel exhaled, returned to his seat, and waited. The night was not done revealing itself. Time had stretched itself thin inside Graystone Manor. The golden light that once made the dining room glow now felt heavy, as if weighed down by its own silence. The air carried that uneasy stillness found in places where everyone senses something wrong, but no one speaks. Ryan moved through it like a man performing a dance he knew too well, smiling, nodding, pretending. His movements were sharp and practiced, but every step seemed to pull him farther from the truth he was avoiding. Each time he passed the table near the kitchen doors, he told himself he was too busy, that there were bigger priorities, that the woman sitting there quiet, patient, unmoving could wait. It's remarkable, really, how easily people convince themselves that cruelty wrapped in routine isn't cruelty at all. Evelyn Brooks sat still, hands folded neatly on the tablecloth. Her book was closed now. Her eyes rested on the empty glass before her, then drifted toward the polished silverware set just beyond reach. She traced the edge of the napkin with one finger, as though she were smoothing the crease between worlds, one polite, one cruel. Across the room, conversations carried on, though more cautiously now. The young couple from earlier had grown quiet. The woman's eyes flicked to Evelyn's table every so often, each glance landing heavier than the last. The man avoided looking altogether. The businessmen in the corner had lost their appetite for laughter. The sound of their forks against porcelain felt awkward, misplaced. Even the pianist hesitated mid-song. A single note lingered too long, then slid into silence before the melody resumed. At the bar, Daniel Brooks watched. His face betrayed nothing. His mother had not once looked in his direction since their brief exchange of eyes earlier, and yet he felt connected to her in every breath. The tension in the room pressed down like invisible smoke. Ryan crossed the floor again, balancing two plates on one arm, a pitcher of water in the other hand. His steps slowed as he neared Evelyn's table. Hesitation flickered, but he turned, heading instead toward the couple near the window. He poured their water first, smiled, asked if they needed anything else. The woman murmured a thank you, her tone polite but distant. She had noticed. They all had. When he passed Evelyn's table again, she lifted her head. Her eyes followed him, not accusing, just steady. Her voice came softly, the first time she'd spoken since she entered. "Excuse me," she said. The sound was calm, clear, and yet it cut through the room with effortless precision. A few heads turned. Ryan stopped mid-step. "Yes." His reply came too quickly. He didn't look at her fully, just enough to acknowledge that she had spoken. "I wonder," Evelyn said gently, "if I might be able to order now." The phrasing was so polite, it almost disguised the weight behind it. Ryan blinked, shifting the tray in his hand. "Of course," he said, tone clipped. I'll be right with you. Ma'am." And then, before she could respond, he turned, walked away. Daniel felt it like a physical blow. His knuckles tightened around the edge of the table until they whitened. His heartbeat echoed faintly in his ears, steady but rising. Evelyn, however, did not move. She merely exhaled. There was no anger in her face, no wounded pride, only that small, tired smile of someone who has seen the world repeat itself too many times to be surprised anymore. She turned her gaze toward the window. Outside, the last light of day had faded, leaving the glass to reflect the inside world, a portrait of civility, polished and fragile. Her own reflection looked back at her, surrounded by faces pretending not to see her. I sometimes think silence is where the soul takes its truest shape. Under pressure, we either shatter or refine. Ryan made his way toward the kitchen, the tray trembling slightly in his grip. Clara caught his arm as he passed the host stand. "Ryan," she whispered, "you need to take her order. Now." He pulled free, eyes hard. I said I'll get to it. You think I can be everywhere at once." Clara looked at him, then at Evelyn. Her expression softened into something like shame. "She's been waiting almost 40 minutes. Ryan didn't answer. He turned sharply, pushing through the kitchen doors with more force than necessary. The sound echoed. Evelyn's head lifted slightly at the noise, but she didn't turn. Her composure remained, fragile yet unbroken. Daniel glanced toward Clara. Their eyes met briefly, and for a split second, she seemed to recognize him, not by name, but by presence. There was authority in the calmness of his stare. She lowered her gaze, guilt prickling the edges of her conscience. The minutes crawled forward. The room breathed in shallow rhythm. Conversations continued, but laughter no longer reached the same height. The air felt dense, as though dignity itself was being tested. Ryan reemerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands. His movements were faster now, sharper, his face set with that defensive expression people wear when they know they're wrong, but refuse to admit it. He stopped near Evelyn's table once more, this time too close to pretend he hadn't seen her. Their eyes met. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that could disarm pride if one were brave enough to see it. "Can I order now, dear?" she asked again, her voice soft as a prayer. Ryan swallowed, shifting his weight. "Yeah, sure," he muttered. He pulled out his notepad, eyes darting toward the bar, where Daniel's calm, unwavering gaze pinned him in invisible judgment. Evelyn took the menu in her hand, though she barely glanced at it. "I think I'll have the salmon," she said, "and some water, please." Her tone was gentle, yet somehow the entire restaurant seemed to hear her. The words floated through the air like a quiet indictment, simple, dignified, impossible to ignore. Ryan scribbled quickly, his face flushed. "Right," he said. "Salmon. Got it." He turned to leave again. "Thank you," she added, with warmth that somehow made his dismissal sting more. He didn't respond. The pianist stopped mid-note again. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Even the sound of silverware felt intrusive. Daniel's chest ached with a strange mix of fury and sorrow. To watch his mother treated this way in his own house was a wound to both pride and faith. But he held still, because he understood now she wasn't enduring this. She was teaching. Her stillness had become a mirror, and in that mirror, every person in that room was being shown exactly who they were. Ryan reached the kitchen doors again, but this time, he didn't push through. He stood there for a second. Glancing back, Evelyn was still sitting there, her hands folded, her expression calm. Her serenity unnerved him. He couldn't name why, but something in her silence made him feel small. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of his reckoning. "I've learned that dignity doesn't argue. It doesn't shout. It simply stands there until the world has no choice but to see it." Evelyn Brooks had waited long enough, and the lesson she was teaching without ever meaning to had only just begun. The sound of silence can be louder than any outburst. That was the kind of silence that settled over Graystone Manor, now thick, electric, waiting. Ryan stood near the kitchen doors, pen still in his hand, trying not to look at the table he had just left. His chest rose and fell too quickly. The room had turned uneasy, conversations thinning into murmurs before fading completely. He didn't know why the air suddenly felt so heavy, only that it did. And then, a chair scraped against the marble floor. Slowly, intentionally, every head turned. Daniel Brooks stood, He didn't slam his napkin down or throw his drink aside. He simply straightened the sleeves of his jacket, adjusted his tie, and began to walk across the dining room. Each step was deliberate, echoing softly in the stillness. The pianist's fingers froze mid-note. The melody collapsed into quiet. Ryan saw him coming, but his brain couldn't seem to make sense of it. He'd noticed the man earlier alone, well-dressed, calm, but hadn't thought much of him. Now, something about his presence commanded attention. Daniel stopped a few feet away. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, and almost unnervingly controlled. "Ryan," he said. The waiter blinked. Sir Daniel's gaze was level. "Do you know who that woman is?" Ryan followed his line of sight toward the corner table, where Evelyn sat, her posture unshaken, her face serene. "She's a customer," he stammered. She just ordered." I was about to. Daniel's tone cut through, calm but sharp. "She's my mother." The words fell like a stone into still water. The ripple was immediate. A gasp, a chair shifting, someone dropping a fork, and then absolute silence. Ryan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face. His pen slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a small metallic tap that seemed to echo for miles. Daniel didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His stillness was enough. "She sat there for 30 minutes, Daniel said, voice still even, though the strain beneath it was visible. 30 minutes. Ryan. Not a glass of water. Not a word. Not a moment of respect." Ryan's eyes flicked toward Evelyn, then back at Daniel. His lips trembled. "Sir, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Daniel's tone was quiet, but there was steel in it. "Didn't mean to ignore her. Didn't mean to make her feel unwelcome in a place that bears my name." He let that hang in the air. The silence pressed in around them. From her table, Evelyn looked up at her son. Her face remained calm, but her eyes held that familiar mixture of pride and pain. She hadn't wanted a scene, but she understood that sometimes truth demands to be spoken aloud. Daniel exhaled slowly, fighting to keep his composure. Every instinct in him wanted to shout, to let his anger pour out like fire. But he didn't, because he remembered her lessons, the difference between reaction and response. He stepped aside slightly, enough to let everyone in the room see her clearly. "This woman," he said, "is the reason this restaurant exists. The reason I exist. Every plate, every wall, every light in this building, none of it would be here without her. And you, Ryan, you looked at her and saw inconvenience." Ryan's eyes filled with panic. His throat tightened as he tried to speak. "I didn't know, sir. I swear, if I had." "That's the point." Daniel's voice sharpened just slightly. "You shouldn't have to know. Respect shouldn't depend on recognition. It should come naturally from decency, from conscience." A murmur spread through the room, then died as quickly as it began. Clara stood frozen near the host stand, her hand covering her mouth. The businessmen in the corner stared down at their plates, shame rising where laughter had been moments ago. The pianist lowered his hands into his lap. Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried across the room like a prayer finding its way home. "Daniel," she said. He turned to her. "It's all right." He shook his head slightly. "No. Mama, it's not." Her smile was faint, tired, but full of grace. "It's not all right," she said, "but it's not new either. Let's not let it poison the air you worked so hard to clear." The words hung there, gentle and devastating. Ryan swallowed hard. tears welling at the corners of his eyes. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm so sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean to disrespect you. I was just busy, I guess." "And busy," Daniel repeated, his voice quiet again. "You were busy serving others who looked the way you thought important people should look." Ryan's shoulders collapsed under the weight of it. He looked at the floor, no longer able to meet anyone's gaze. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she said softly, "You have a good job here, son. Don't let your eyes make you blind." Ryan nodded weakly, shame burning through him. Daniel's anger had cooled into something heavier now, disappointment. It wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about the truth this moment revealed, the gap between intention and reality. He had built Graystone Manor to be a place of equality, and yet prejudice had found its way in through the smallest cracks. He turned toward the room. "Let this be clear," he said, his tone steady but final. "Every person who walks through those doors deserves dignity. I don't care who they are or what they look like. If that principle is too hard to follow, then Graystone Manor isn't your place to work or to dine." No one moved. No one breathed. Evelyn stood then, slowly, gracefully. She took her son's arm, her hand small against the fine fabric of his jacket. Her touch steadied him more than any words could. "Come, Daniel," she said gently. "Sit with me. Let's not make the lesson longer than it needs to be." He hesitated, then nodded. Together, they walked back to her table. The waiter who had once ignored her now pulled out her chair with trembling hands. When Daniel sat beside her, the room seemed to exhale all at once. The pianist, after a moment, began to play again a slow, tender melody that filled the silence with something like forgiveness. Ryan stepped back, eyes lowered, and disappeared into the kitchen. Evelyn reached for her glass. Clara hurried to fill it with water, her hands shaking slightly. Evelyn smiled at her. "Thank you, dear," Clara whispered. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Evelyn nodded. "Then do better next time." Her tone wasn't harsh. It was a kindness so honest it left nowhere to hide. Daniel looked at his mother. "You handled that better than I ever could." She smiled faintly. "That's why you have me," she said, "to remind you that calm is stronger than fury." The room began to move again, voices low, cautious, thoughtful. Something in the air had changed. Perhaps not everything, but something important. And as the pianist's melody carried softly through the dining hall, Daniel looked around his restaurant and thought, maybe this is what justice sounds like, not loud, not angry, but quiet, certain, and impossible to ignore. The silence lingered after the music faded, even as the pianist's hands rested motionless on the keys. The melody seemed to echo in the space between breaths, haunting and weightless. Every person in the dining room knew the rhythm of the evening had changed. Something irreversible had been spoken into existence. Ryan stood near the kitchen door, his back half turned, hoping for some invisible curtain to fall between him and the truth that now stood so naked before everyone. But there was none. Daniel Brooks rose from his chair once again, this time with no hesitation. The air around him felt different now, not angry, not cold, but decisive. He looked toward the manager's station where Mrs. Harper, a middle-aged woman in a neat blazer, stood frozen in disbelief. Her hand clutched a clipboard, knuckles white. "Ms. Harper," Daniel said evenly. She straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir. Please take over service for Mrs. Brooks." Her eyes widened. "Of course." She started toward Evelyn's table at once, head slightly bowed, her steps quick but composed. There was an unspoken apology in every motion. Daniel's attention shifted to Ryan. The young waiter stood stiff, eyes down, trying to steady the trembling in his hands. The white apron tied around his waist looked suddenly out of place, too clean, too hopeful. "Ryan," Daniel said, voice low but carrying, "take off your apron." Ryan's eyes lifted, confusion crossing his face. "Sir, I know," Daniel repeated. There was no cruelty in his tone, only clarity. It was the kind of voice that didn't invite discussion. Ryan's mouth opened as if to explain, then closed again. Slowly, almost mechanically. His fingers moved to untie the knot at his back. The string slipped loose. The apron came away in his hands. For a long moment, he just stared at it, this small piece of cloth that had once symbolized his place, his purpose. Then, as if realizing everyone was watching, he folded it neatly. His movements were clumsy, but he tried. Maybe it was his last attempt to hold on to some kind of dignity. Daniel watched him without expression. Inside, though, he felt no satisfaction, only the deep, familiar ache that comes from witnessing consequences finally catch up to their cause. When Ryan looked up, his voice cracked. "Sir, please, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I just got busy. I wasn't thinking." Daniel took a slow breath. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You weren't thinking. You were judging." The words landed heavier than any shout could have. Ryan's shoulders sagged. His eyes darted toward Evelyn's table, where she sat quietly watching him. There was no malice in her gaze, no gloating, just a soft sadness that made it harder to bear. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, voice breaking. "I really am." Evelyn nodded gently. "I believe you," she said. "But sometimes, sorry's only the beginning. What matters is who you choose to be after." He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." Daniel's voice came again, quiet but absolute. "You can leave your things in the back. You're done for the day." Ryan hesitated, the weight of disbelief settling in. For a split second, he looked as though he might argue, then thought better of it. His eyes burned as he turned toward the kitchen. The path to the door felt impossibly long. Every footstep echoed in the still air, a rhythm of humiliation that seemed to slow time itself. Clara, near the host stand, watched him go with tears building quietly in her eyes. She had seen arrogance before, seen mistakes, but this was something deeper, the kind of downfall that didn't just change one man, but rippled through everyone who witnessed it. Ryan reached the doorway, stopped once, then looked back. His eyes found Daniel's, searching for something: mercy, forgiveness, maybe understanding. Daniel met his gaze steadily. "Let this teach you what no training ever could," he said. Ryan nodded once, the motion sharp, final. Then he disappeared through the kitchen doors. The silence that followed was almost sacred. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was reflection, a collective moment where every person in the room seemed to measure themselves against what they had just seen. "Ms." Harper arrived at Evelyn's table, setting down a fresh glass of water. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured. "Mrs. Brooks," she said softly, "I'm deeply sorry for how you were treated." Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes kind. "Thank you, dear. I've been treated worse by better people. The important thing is that we learn." The manager's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am." Daniel exhaled, feeling the room slowly return to motion around him. Conversations began again in hushed tones. The pianist started to play once more a soft, mournful piece that drifted through the air like rain after a storm. He looked at his mother. "You're handling this better than I am." Evelyn's lips curved into a small smile. "Because I've had practice," she said. "Life will test your patience before it tests your power. How you pass that test decides the kind of man you are." He nodded slowly, the truth of her words sinking deep. She reached across the table, touching his hand. "You did what you needed to do. But remember, Daniel, it's not enough to punish the wrong. You must also guide the lost." "I know," he said softly. "I just needed to make sure everyone understood." "They do," she replied, "and so do you." Across the room, Clara began to move again, greeting new guests with a different kind of tone, warmer, intentional. The businessmen in the corner sat quietly, each of them suddenly self-conscious about the way they'd ignored what was happening earlier. Even the young couple near the window smiled faintly toward Evelyn, a silent gesture of respect. The entire restaurant seemed to breathe differently now, as if the truth had cleared the air. I sometimes think justice isn't about punishment at all. It's about awareness, the painful kind that changes how you walk through the world afterward. Evelyn lifted her glass at last, the water catching the light in small ripples. "To lessons," she said quietly. Daniel smiled, raising his own. "To lessons," he echoed. From the kitchen doorway, a faint sound echoed, perhaps the back door closing. Ryan was gone, but the echo of his fall remained, not as bitterness, but as a warning. For everyone. The pianist's melody swelled, then softened again, the notes curling upward like forgiveness taking shape. Evelyn looked peaceful now, her reflection shimmering in the polished glass of the table, calm, certain, and impossibly strong. Daniel leaned back slightly, letting out a long breath. Around them, Graystone Manor resumed its rhythm service, conversation, the clinking of silver. Yet beneath it all, something fundamental had shifted. Respect had been restored, not through power, but through example. And in that moment, Daniel realized something profound. His mother hadn't just taught him dignity. She was dignity. Sometimes, I think strength isn't measured by how loud we rise, but by how quietly we stand when the world gets small. Evelyn Brooks had stood silently until the world around her remembered what humanity was supposed to look like. And in the quiet aftermath of that night, Graystone Manor finally became the place Daniel had always dreamed it could be. The storm had passed, but the air still trembled with what it had witnessed. Conversations at Graystone Manor began again. Softer this time, voices weighed down by reflection rather than appetite. The pianist played a slow, familiar tune, something gentle enough not to disturb what was left of the silence. At the corner table, Evelyn Brooks sat quietly, her posture as steady as ever. The candle beside her had burned low, its flame flickering against the glass in soft gold waves. Daniel walked toward her, each step measured. His anger long cooled into something more tender, more human. He stopped beside her table. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked, "May I join you?" Evelyn looked up, her eyes warm with a knowing calm. "You may," she said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. He sat, the leather seat sighing under his weight. For the first time that evening, he allowed his shoulders to relax. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation drained away, leaving only the ache of what remained. They sat in silence, mother and son, as the world around them stitched itself back together. After a while, Evelyn spoke. "You did well, Daniel." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. It didn't feel like it. She smiled faintly. "That's because justice rarely feels good in the moment. It feels heavy because it is." Daniel's gaze drifted toward the kitchen doors where Ryan had disappeared earlier. "I didn't want to humiliate him," he said. "I just wanted him to understand." Evelyn nodded. "Sometimes humiliation isn't what we give. It's what pride does to itself when truth walks in." He leaned back slightly, considering her words. There was something comforting about her tone, neither harsh nor forgiving, just clear, like a bell that rings only once, but echoes long after. "You know," Daniel said quietly, "I keep thinking about the moment before I stood up. I saw you sitting there, waiting, and I felt ashamed that it happened here, that it happened to you." Her eyes softened. "It didn't happen to me, Daniel. It happened around me. I was just the mirror that showed them who they were." He stared at her, trying to absorb the weight of that truth. "I wanted to step in sooner," he admitted, "to stop it before it went that far." "I know," she said gently, "but sometimes the hardest thing is to wait to let people reveal their own lessons." She paused, glancing toward the window where dusk had deepened into evening. If you had stopped him too soon, Ryan might never have seen himself, and no one else in that room would have either. Daniel followed her gaze. Outside, the reflection of the restaurant's warm lights shimmered on the glass. He could see their outlines, the shape of a sun, the shadow of his mother framed by quiet radiance. "I just wish it hadn't been you," he said softly. Evelyn smiled again, this time with the tenderness of someone who had long made peace with the world's imperfections. "Son, people like me have been teaching lessons like that all our lives. It's never pleasant, but it's necessary." He lowered his head. "You shouldn't have to keep teaching." Her laugh was gentle, a small ripple in the still air. "And yet, here I am, still teaching, and you still learning." He chuckled softly despite himself. "That sounds like you." "I hope so," she said. "Because if it doesn't, then I failed at something." For a long while, they said nothing more. The sounds of the restaurant filled the space between them, cutlery clinking, a quiet murmur of conversation, the steady hum of the piano's low notes. It was life returning, humble and subdued. Daniel watched his mother's hands as she folded the napkin on her lap. They were small hands, delicate but strong, the kind that had built things quietly: homes, hearts, lives. He thought about the nights she had worked 2 jobs so he could study, the morning she left before sunrise, her perfume faint on his coat as she kissed his forehead goodbye, the lessons she never needed to repeat because she lived them instead of speaking them. "I think I understand now," he said finally. "Understand what that strength isn't about control," he said. "It's about grace, about knowing when not to fight." She nodded slowly, her eyes shining. "Then you've learned more than I could have told you." He smiled, a quiet, grateful smile. "I learned it from you." Evelyn looked down for a moment, her expression softening. "You know," she said after a pause, "when you stood up earlier, I saw your father in you, the way you held your voice steady. He was like that, gentle, but immovable." Daniel's throat tightened. "He would have been proud of you, too." "Perhaps," she said, "but I'm the one sitting here with a free meal, so I'll take the compliment." He laughed a small, real laugh that broke through the heaviness like sunlight. Their conversation drifted after that, moving between memories and comfortable silences. There was no need for grand declarations, just the unspoken bond between two people who had already said everything that mattered. I think that's what love looks like. When it matures, it doesn't shout. It simply stays. As the hour grew late, the pianist began one last song, a slow, nostalgic piece that wrapped itself gently around the room. Evelyn looked up, listening. Her face softened into a faraway expression, like she was hearing not just music, but years. Daniel followed her gaze. "You always loved this song." "I did," she said. "Your father played it once on our anniversary. The notes are simple, but the pauses make it beautiful. That's what people forget. It's the silence that gives meaning to sound." Daniel looked at her then, really looked at the lines etched by time, at the grace that no insult could ever tarnish. "I'm sorry you had to go through that tonight," he said quietly. Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was warm, steady. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Be aware. The world changes when awareness meets compassion." He nodded, the words settling deep inside him like a seed. Around them, the last guest began to leave. "Ms." Harper approached the table discreetly, placing the check down with a soft, respectful smile. "No charge tonight," she said. Evelyn smiled back. "Thank you. But fairness means we still pay." Daniel slipped his card across the table before Ms. Harper could protest. "Let's call it even," he said. When she left, Evelyn gave him that look mothers give when pride and amusement mix. "You always did like having the last word." "Only when it's the right one," he replied. She rose slowly, adjusting her coat. The night outside waited, cool and forgiving. Daniel helped her into it, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Con l'âme tout roi," she whispered in their old tongue, a language she rarely used anymore. "You did well." He smiled faintly, his eyes soft. "I just wish it hadn't needed to happen." Evelyn looked up at him, her voice calm. Sometimes, to remind the world what respect looks like, someone has to sit quietly and wait for it to remember. They stood there for a moment, side by side, mother and son, framed by the fading light of the restaurant, and as they turned toward the door, the pianist struck the final chord, a note that lingered just long enough to remind everyone listening that dignity, once revealed, never truly fades. When Evelyn Brooks and her son left the restaurant, the door closed behind them with a hush that felt almost ceremonial. Yet their departure didn't end the evening. It left something suspended in the air, an aftertaste of truth that lingered longer than any wine poured that night. The murmur returned slowly. It began at one table, then spread like ripples through still water. Conversations were no longer about business deals or vacation plans, but about what they had just seen. A woman near the window leaned toward her husband. "It was terrible," she whispered, "but somehow, I'm glad I saw it." He nodded, eyes fixed on his glass. "Makes you think about how many times we've looked away." At another table, one of the businessmen who had earlier chuckled too loudly now stared into the dim light of the chandelier. He hadn't eaten since the confrontation. "That old lady," he said quietly to no one in particular. "She didn't raise her voice once. Not once." No one replied. They didn't need to. Everyone understood the weight of silence now. Across the room, Clara the hostess stood at her podium, fingers resting on the reservation book. She had greeted hundreds of guests before, all with the same rehearsed politeness, but tonight felt different. She caught herself glancing at every new face with a quiet question she'd never asked before. "Who are you really, before I decide who you seem to be?" The pianist began again, this time softer, as if he too was part of the reflection. His notes drifted between tables like smoke, curling around unfinished thoughts. Each sound seemed to whisper, "Remember?" In the kitchen, the staff worked quietly. The usual clang of pans was muted, voices hushed. Ms. Harper, the manager, moved between stations, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She wasn't barking orders tonight. Instead, she spoke in low, steady tones, kind but firm. Every word carried the echo of Daniel Brooks' calm authority. "We serve people," she said to the line cooks. "All kinds of people. If you forget that, you forget why we're here." No one argued. Even the dishwasher, usually half hidden behind the noise of running water, nodded in silent agreement. Outside in the dining room, a young waitress paused beside the bar. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" she asked quietly. "Meaning Ryan?" Clara shook her head. "Maybe not," she said, "but maybe he'll remember." That thought seemed to settle something between them, a small thread of forgiveness weaving itself through the air. For the first time all evening, the room began to feel human again. Not perfect, not absolved, but aware. And awareness, as Evelyn Brooks might have said, is the beginning of every kind of grace. I've always believed that lessons don't end when the moment does. They stay, tucked inside the ordinary hours that follow, waiting for us to notice. By 9:30, the restaurant had quieted. The last of the guests were paying their bills, moving slower than usual, as if reluctant to break the fragile peace that had settled over the room. A man near the door turned to his wife before leaving. "You think they planned it?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "No," she said. "That kind of truth doesn't need a script." Near the back, Ms. Harper collected menus, straightening them in neat stacks. When she reached Evelyn's table, she stopped. The napkin was folded perfectly, the water glass half full. Beside it sat a small handwritten note, folded once, addressed simply, "For the staff." She opened it. The handwriting was elegant, steady. "Respect begins where assumption ends. Thank you for learning that with us tonight. E. Brooks Ms." Harper read it twice before tucking it carefully into her pocket. Later, she would pin it on the staff board in the kitchen, not as a reprimand, but as a reminder. Clara approached her quietly. "You keep in that yes, Ms." Harper said. "It belongs here." They stood together for a moment, watching the empty table that somehow felt fuller than all the others combined. At the bar, a man who had been drinking alone all night turned to the bartender. "That lady," he said, shaking his head slowly. "She had more class in her silence than most people do in their speeches." The bartender nodded. "Guess that's what dignity looks like," he said. "Doesn't make a sound, but you still hear it." The clock struck 10. The music faded to a close. Chairs were pushed in, lights dimmed, one by one. The guests drifted out into the cool Seattle night. But as the doors shut behind them, none of them felt quite the same. Something small had shifted, subtle, but real. I think that's the strange power of witnessing grace. It doesn't scold you. It just stands there quietly until you realize you've been the one out of tune. When the last customer left, Ms. Harper gathered the staff near the hostess stand. The group stood in a loose circle. Clara, the young waitress, the line cooks, even the dishwasher who rarely joined meetings. The lights cast a warm glow across their tired faces. She held the folded note in her hand. "I won't make this long," she said, "but I think we all saw something tonight that we needed to see. We forgot that service isn't about who deserves kindness. It's about giving it before it's earned." No one spoke. A few nodded. "We'll do better," Clara said softly. "Ms." Harper smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "we will." They dispersed slowly, the air lighter than before. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension, only understanding. Back at her station, Clara switched off the reservation light. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass door, older somehow, though only an hour had passed. She thought of Evelyn Brooks' calm voice, her steady gaze. "Don't let your eyes make you blind." The words lingered like a promise. Outside, rain had begun to fall, gentle and rhythmic against the sidewalk. The city glowed under its silver veil. "Ms." Harper stood by the door, locking up, and paused for a moment to listen. The rain sounded like applause, quiet, endless, forgiving. She smiled. Inside, the piano remained silent now, but its echoes hung in the air. The table where Evelyn Brooks had sat glimmered faintly in the candle's dying flame, the reflection of a woman whose silence had taught an entire room how to listen again. And in that silence, Graystone Manor found something it hadn't known. It had lost its soul. The restaurant was closed, but no one had gone home yet. The clock above the bar read 10:47 p.m., and Graystone Manor had never been this quiet after hours. The last of the candles flickered low, tracing tired faces with gold light. The staff stood in a half circle near the hostess stand servers, cooks, dishwashers, all gathered without a word. Some leaned on chairs, others clasped their hands nervously, waiting. "Ms." Harper stood before them, the folded note from Evelyn Brooks still in her hand. She didn't rush to speak. She looked around the room first, the same space that had seen laughter, luxury, and pride, and tonight, something closer to truth. When she finally began, her voice was steady, softer than usual. "All right," she said, "let's talk." The words settled over them like a calm breeze. She held up the note. "This was left on Miss Brooks' table. I think it was meant for all of us." She unfolded it carefully and read aloud. "Respect begins where assumption ends. Thank you for learning that with us tonight." Her voice wavered just slightly at the end. When she looked up, no one moved. "I don't think she meant that as a scolding, Ms." Harper said. "She meant it as a gift, and if we're wise, we'll take it that way." One of the younger waitresses, her apron still dusted with flour, raised her hand hesitantly. Was that really Daniel's mother? "Yes, Ms." Harper replied, and she handled herself with more grace than any of us could have managed in her place. The girl nodded slowly, eyes lowered. I can't stop thinking about how calm she was. If that had been me, I'd have walked out." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. "That's the thing, Ms." Harper said. She didn't have to fight to prove her worth. She already knew it. That's what dignity looks like. Clara stepped forward a little. "It's hard, though," she said quietly. "We see hundreds of faces every night. Some treat us kindly, some don't. It's easy to start guessing who deserves our best." "Ms." Harper nodded. "You're right. But that's the danger of this job and of life, really. The minute we start deciding who's worth respect, we lose the very thing that makes service noble." Her gaze swept over them. "No one in this room is here just to carry plates or pour wine. We're here because people trust us to see them, not their money, not their clothes, not their color, but them. A cook near the back crossed his arms. So what happens now? Do we just forget it happened? Harper shook her head. No. We remember. We let it change us. She turned toward the kitchen doorway. The hum of the refrigerators faint in the distance. What happened tonight wasn't about one waiter. It was about all of us. Because any one of us could have done the same thing if we weren't paying attention. Her words carried no accusation, just clarity. I think that's what leadership sounds like when it's done right. Not loud, just true. Ryan made a mistake. She continued. But he also gave us something we can't buy or teach from a manual perspective. The dishwasher. A quiet man named Luis finally spoke. You think he'll come back? I don't know, Ms., Harper said. But I hope, wherever he is, he learns what Mrs. Brooks was trying to teach. Because people like her don't appear in our lives for no reason. Clara crossed her arms thoughtfully. You know what struck me most, she said. It wasn't Daniel stepping in. It was the way she looked at Ryan like she was sorry for him, like she already forgave him. A long silence followed. That's what I want you all to remember, Ms., Harper said. Grace doesn't mean letting people walk over you. It means choosing calm when the world hands you cruelty. It's power that doesn't need noise. The group stood quietly, taking it in. She walked to the chalkboard near the entrance, the one where they usually wrote the specials of the day. Picking up a piece of white chalk, she wrote in slow, deliberate letters, "No one is less." The words glowed softly in the dim light. That's our rule from now on, she said, setting the chalk down. Not just for the guests, but for each other. Clara smiled faintly. I like that. Louis nodded. We should keep it there, he said, right where everyone can see it. Ms. Harper looked at the message, then back at her team. We will, she said. One of the cooks cleared his throat. Ms. Harper, can I ask something? Go ahead. Do you think Daniel planned to tell us who she was? She shook her head. No, I think he hoped he'd never have to. Her tone carried a quiet respect for the man who had built this place, not with marble or silverware, but with values. I think tonight reminded him too, she said. Even owners need reminding. Outside, rain continued to fall, tapping gently against the tall windows. It was steady, rhythmic, cleansing. Inside, something similar was happening, a quiet renewal, one person at a time. They began to disperse slowly. Some lingered near the bar. Others slipped into the kitchen to gather their things. The mood was heavy but not hopeless. It felt like a wound that had finally started to close. As Clara turned out the last of the lights, she glanced once more at the chalkboard. No one is less. The letters shimmered faintly in the dimness. She thought of Mrs. Brooks's gentle smile, the kind of smile that didn't just forgive, it taught. I think every place has a night that changes it. For Graystone Manor, this was theirs. Before leaving, Ms. Harper stood alone in the doorway. She looked out across the empty dining room, the soft chairs, the polished glasses, the quiet that felt almost alive. She whispered to herself, "Let's be worthy of the name." Then she turned off the last light. The words on the chalkboard glowed faintly in the dark for a moment longer, then disappeared into stillness. The restaurant was empty again, the kind of empty that carries memory rather than absence. Daniel Brooks sat alone at one of the corner tables, the same one where his mother had sat just hours earlier. The lights were dim now, casting long shadows that folded gently across the polished floor. A single candle still burned beside him, its small flame trembling in the air-conditioned quiet. The clock near the bar read 11:26 put. But Daniel wasn't watching the time. His hands were clasped loosely on the table, his thoughts wandering between the night's noise and its stillness. The room that had once been filled with conversation now seemed to breathe, slow and heavy, as though it too was reflecting. He could still see it all, his mother's calm face, Ryan's stammering apology, the stunned silence that had swallowed the entire restaurant when he spoke the words, "She's my mother." The memory was sharp, but it wasn't anger that held him now. It was something deeper, quieter, understanding. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Somewhere in his memory, his mother's voice rose like a thread of melody. Ton trong goikachla nen tang kwathang kong. Respect for others is the foundation of success. She had said it so many times while he was growing up that the words had nearly lost their meaning until tonight. He remembered being a teenager, standing in their small kitchen while she ironed his shirt for a school debate. She had looked at him over her glasses and said, "You can be the smartest in the room, Daniel, but if you make someone feel small, you've already lost." At the time, he'd thought she meant it as a lecture about manners. Now, he realized it had been a blueprint for life. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Outside, rain tapped against the window in slow rhythm. He watched it trail down the glass, each droplet catching the city's reflection in miniature. Funny, he thought, how something so soft can reshape everything it touches. Daniel had always thought being an owner meant knowing how to run a place, managing people, balancing budgets, keeping the brand alive. But tonight had changed that. Being an owner, he understood now, wasn't about control. It was about culture. It wasn't about profit margins or perfect service, but about the unseen current that moved beneath all of it, humanity. He looked around the room again. Every table had a story, first dates, anniversaries, deals made and broken. And yet, the one that would stay with him wasn't about any of that. It was about a glass of water never served, and the silence that revealed everything that truly mattered. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The staff message thread still glowed on the screen from earlier. Ms. Harper had sent a picture of the chalkboard near the entrance with 3 white words written boldly across it. "No one is less." He stared at it for a long moment, his chest tightening a little. He typed a short message in reply. "Keep that there, indefinitely." Then he set the phone down and let the stillness return. I think every leader has a night that changes them. Not a grand moment of applause or success, but a quiet reckoning, the kind that strips away pride and leaves only truth. This was his. He rose from the table and walked toward the window. The rain had softened into mist now, and the street outside shimmered under the lamplight. The reflection of the restaurant sign, Graystone Manor, glowed faintly in the puddles. He wondered if his mother was home yet, maybe sitting by her window the way she used to when he was a boy, waiting for him to return from his first job at a diner on Pike Street. She'd waited up that night too, smiling when he came in exhausted but proud. He remembered telling her how unfair customers could be, how one man had scolded him for bringing the wrong drink, how another hadn't even looked him in the eye when paying. She had listened quietly, then said, "The hardest job in the world is serving people and still seeing their worth. But that's how you grow your own." Now, decades later, he understood. Tonight, He hadn't just seen prejudice, he had seen blindness, his own included. For all his success, he had built Graystone with the same invisible lines society drew long before him: class, comfort, subtle exclusion masked as refinement. He hadn't meant to, but he hadn't stopped it either. And that was the same thing. He turned and looked at the empty tables again. His reflection caught faintly in the glass behind him. "It ends here," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but to the air itself. "It ends here." He walked to the bar, poured himself a small glass of water, and sat back down. The taste was simple, clean, like beginning again. Somewhere in the back hallway, he could still hear faint movement. Ms. Harper must have been checking the locks or finishing the nightly reports. He made a mental note to thank her tomorrow, not for handling the incident, but for leading with conscience. He thought, too, about Ryan. The young man's face had been pale, his hands shaking when he realized who Mrs. Brooks really was. Daniel didn't hate him. He pitied him, the way his mother had. Maybe, if Ryan learned from this, he'd someday understand that humility is a kind of grace that can't be taught, only earned through failure. Daniel finished his drink and sat quietly for a long while. When he finally stood, he walked to the table where his mother had sat and placed a hand gently on its edge. The wood was cool beneath his palm. He imagined her there again, poised, patient, unbroken. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly, "for reminding me what this place was supposed to be." He turned off the last light and started toward the door. But before leaving, he glanced once more at the chalkboard in the entryway. The message glowed faintly in the darkness, just as Ms. Harper had left it. "No one is less." He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, and stepped out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped. The city was quiet. Somewhere, far away, a church bell chimed midnight, steady, unhurried, eternal. And in that sound, Daniel Brooks felt something inside him settle, a kind of peace that doesn't erase pain, but honors it, turning it into purpose. He locked the door behind him, looked once more at the sign above the restaurant, and whispered to himself, Graystone Manor just became what it was always meant to be. The morning after the storm of revelation, the city woke under a calm, golden light. Seattle had a way of forgiving the night. Quickly streets washed clean, windows glinting, coffee shops humming with new beginnings. But inside Daniel Brooks, something was still shifting, something deeper than relief. He stood at the front door of his mother's home, a modest brick house tucked at the edge of Queen Anne Hill, where the view overlooked the Sound. He had been there hundreds of times before, but today, the walk from his car to the porch felt heavier, like carrying a truth that needed to be spoken aloud. When Mrs. Evelyn Brooks opened the door, she was already smiling. "I knew you'd come early," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Daniel returned the smile, though his eyes still carried the weight of reflection. "You know me too well," he said softly. "I should," she replied. "I raised you." The scent of freshly brewed tea filled the air. Jasmine, her favorite. The kitchen was warm, bathed in the same kind of sunlight that had touched the restaurant windows the night before. Daniel followed her to the small breakfast nook, where 2 cups sat waiting. For a while, they didn't talk. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that knows it doesn't have to prove anything. The ticking of the wall clock was steady, patient, like a metronome keeping time for an unseen lesson still unfolding. Evelyn finally looked up from her cup. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" Daniel shook his head. Not really. I stayed at the restaurant for a while after everyone left. Thinking, she said knowingly. He nodded. About a lot of things. About what happened. About what it means. He paused, then smiled faintly. About you. She chuckled quietly, stirring her tea. You sound like a man who's just discovered something he should have known all along. Maybe I have, he admitted. I thought owning a business was about keeping it running, making sure people liked the food, the service, the name. But it's more than that. It's about the space we create for people to be seen, to feel equal. And last night, I realized that space wasn't as pure as I thought it was. Evelyn sipped her tea before answering. It's never pure, Daniel. Not unless the people inside it make it so. He looked down, tracing his finger along the rim of his cup. I failed to see it. Mom, all those years I thought Graystone was a symbol of success. But maybe it was just a mirror showing us who we really are. She leaned back, her expression softening. It's not failure to see what was hidden. It's failure to do nothing once you do. Daniel met her gaze. Then I guess it's time to start doing something. She smiled the kind of smile that carries history and forgiveness in the same breath. I believe you already have. They sat in silence again, the morning sun painting the table in soft amber tones. Outside, the wind brushed through the garden, stirring the hydrangeas she'd planted years ago. Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter now. When I saw how Ryan treated you, I wanted to step in right away. But you didn't even flinch. You didn't fight back. Her eyes twinkled. You wanted me to yell, didn't you? Maybe a little, he admitted, smiling. You had every right to. Evelyn chuckled. And what good would that have done? Anger only teaches those who already know. Calm teaches those who don't. He thought about that for a moment. You taught me that when I was a kid. He said, I just didn't realize how powerful it really was until last night. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. You did the right thing, Daniel. Not because you fired that young man, but because you let the truth reveal itself. That's leadership. That's respect in action. He squeezed her hand gently. I just hope it made a difference. For them, for everyone who saw it. Oh, it did, she said, with quiet conviction. You gave them something they'll carry longer than guilt perspective. People forget rules, but they remember the moment they understood why the rules exist. Daniel leaned back, taking in her words. You always manage to make everything sound simple. She smiled. That's because the truth usually is. We just like to make it complicated so we can excuse ourselves from living it. Outside, the sunlight grew brighter, spilling through the glass and reflecting off the framed photographs on the wall. Memories of decades spent weathering storms and finding joy between them. One of the pictures showed a younger Daniel, standing proudly beside his mother at the opening of Graystone Manor years ago. His hair had been longer then, his smile wider, his understanding smaller. He stood and walked toward it, touching the corner of the frame lightly. We've come a long way, he said quietly. Evelyn joined him, her gaze following his. Yes, she said, and the road ahead will be even longer, but maybe now it'll be the right one. Daniel turned to her, the sunlight catching his face. You've always been my compass, he said. And you, she said softly, are the proof that the compass worked. They both laughed gently, the kind of laughter that warms more than it entertains. After a while, Daniel checked his watch. I should head back soon. There's a lot to do. Evelyn nodded. Go on. Then, they'll need your guidance. But remember, guidance isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about being the one who listens first. He smiled, leaning down to kiss her cheek. I'll remember that. As he opened the door to leave, she called after him, her voice calm but clear. Daniel. He turned back. You gave everyone last night a lesson they won't forget. He hesitated, then said softly, I just hope it helps them change. Evelyn smiled, her eyes shining with quiet pride. It already has. The morning light poured through the doorway, wrapping them both in its golden warmth. For a moment, the reflections in the glass caught their figures, mother and son, standing together, framed by sunlight and understanding. And as Daniel stepped out into the day, he realized that Graystone Manor wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a promise that every act of grace, no matter how small, carries farther than anger ever could. Because dignity, he now knew, doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. It shines best in silence, steady, certain, unbreakable. Thank you for watching and staying with us until the end. If this story moved you even just a little, then its silence has spoken. At its heart, this wasn't a story about anger or punishment. It was about grace, about the quiet strength it takes to stay calm when the world pushes you to break, and about how dignity, when it stands tall, doesn't need to shout to be heard. We believe the world still needs stories like this, stories that remind us what kindness, respect, and empathy can do. If you feel the same, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might need a little light today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of silent strength, human truth, and quiet justice. Because sometimes the softest voices carry the deepest lessons. Thank you for being here and for believing that compassion still matters.